Okay, we are ready. I invite those of you who are not seated to take your seats for our afternoon in discussion panel. This will follow on some of the discussions we've been having already today about the nature of communities and the unitive power of value, and then we were talking in the last session about how we ought to respond as persons to communities both local and cosmopolitan. And we're going to continue that discussion now, talking about a personalist orientation towards our own communities, both at various levels and hierarchies of community, and some of the problems that sort of in the air today as people discuss that. One word you've probably heard is integralism as a possible solution to the thesis that liberal values are somehow incompatible with unitive values and starting communities robustly built around values. So we want to discuss some of the problems with that, some of the ideas also just that are in the air about that. I'm going to turn it over to my panelists who will each present some aspect either of liberalism or integralism or some of the concerns that they may have. We'll talk about it and open it up for discussion as much as we can through the afternoon. So we'll start with Peter Meilaender here to my left. Is this your first time presenting?
Yes.
Today? So you all might not know Peter yet. Peter is one of our associated scholars and a professor at Houghton University.
Didn't know that.
Are you associated scholar?
I've been promoted, apparently.
You are now. Congratulations.
I didn't know it was so easy, but
we're going to send you an invoice.
So we'll tell you a little bit about why Peter is speaking with us. It'd be best to hear it from yourself. So go ahead, Peter.
Okay. So a little bit very quickly about me and what I bring to this or where I come from. I'm a political scientist, specifically a political theorist, so my degree is in political philosophy. I teach a little bit of everything because I'm at a very small school, but I come to whatever it is, humanities, history, literature, with the interests of a political theorist in mind in terms of the kind of questions that I ask. Theologically, I'm a Lutheran with a pretty good Lutheran pedigree. I have been married to a Catholic for over 25 years, and I have taught at an evangelical Wesleyan college for over 20 years. So you can either think of me as a mongrel, or as the incarnation of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, depending on how you want to think about that. But so I think I do have maybe an appreciation for some of the strengths that different traditions bring to the church broadly considered as a whole. Because I'm a political theorist, and maybe I'll say I would describe myself as both conservative and a liberal, by which I don't mean right-wing and left-wing, which wouldn't work exactly, but somebody who is shaped in important ways by the tradition of post-war modern American conservatism, which aims in large measure at conserving the broadly classically liberal American constitutional order. And so I'm perfectly happy actually to be described as a liberal in that sense, and to think of myself even as a defender of liberalism. So I sort of experience integralism or the various theories that might be labeled post-liberalism of various kinds. So few non-Catholics would call themselves integralists. Any number of people who criticize liberalism from a range of Christian perspectives. I experience that post-liberal view as a challenge to something that I regard as by and large worth defending. And so I've been asked to lead off here by saying a little bit about what liberalism is in the first place. What is this system that some of our compatriots, perhaps some of you, think has outlived its usefulness, perhaps has undermined itself, can no longer serve the ends that it was intended to serve, or maybe that it was never, maybe cannot serve ends, was never intended to serve ends that it should serve. That's another way of thinking about it. And so what is liberalism? What is this thing this label we use for our way of governing ourselves and living together that seems now to be very much under dispute? And I think of liberalism, and I should just say, I'm going to describe how I understand liberalism. It's by no means the only way to describe it. In fact, I think one of the important things about liberalism is that there are many liberalisms. And so when we criticize this thing, it's important to know which version we're talking about. I think of liberalism more as a way of doing politics than as a theory. A body of practices that have grown up over time, in particular around ideas about limiting power, a way of demarcating the sphere of political life as opposed to other spheres of life, and trying to limit power in order to achieve peace. So that's broadly speaking how I think of it. Let me say a little bit more specifically about that. I'd like to suggest that this way of doing politics arises in particular out of two long-term historical trends, and then I'll close by making just a few brief observations about that before handing it on to my colleagues. So two trends that I think help produce this way of doing politics. The first, liberalism, arises importantly out of the European wars of religion. So after the Reformation, Europe for 100 plus years was embroiled in a series of wars, very devastating, terrible wars, culminating perhaps in the 30 Years' War. It's not culminating, it's not the last one, but one of the last really significant ones, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, a continent-wide war, bringing in all of the European powers, absolutely devastating for Central Europe. I think I'll probably get the number wrong, but I think about a third of the population of what would now be Germany is thought to have died in the 30 Years' War. So we've got roughly 3 people at a table, right? So a person's gone from every table in the room in the course of those wars. So just a terrible experience. And coming out of that sort of background, people began to think that perhaps the union of church and state that had allowed those wars to go on was a problem. And so one of the things that people start to do, certainly not for the first time, but I think with a new kind of clarity, is to demarcate the appropriate sphere of political authority as opposed to other kinds of authority, to distinguish properly political authority. And to do that it serves a dual purpose, right? It protects the state from encroachment by other kinds of authorities, and it also protects other kinds of authorities, the church being the most obvious, from encroachment by the state. So there's an effort, in order to achieve peace, to sort of identify the kinds of things that politics deals with. In particular, just to borrow some language, external temporal goods, life, liberty, property, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, shelter, a home, the goods that you need to preserve your life. These are the sorts of things that politics is about, and specifically not about the salvation of souls. So that's a key distinction that gets made to generate liberal politics. So demarcating the sphere of politics coming out of the wars of religion. The second trend is really, you might say that even after you've sort of, demarcated the sphere of politics, the state remains a daunting body. It exercises potentially scary kinds of power over you, kinds of power that other authorities don't exercise. In particular, it can deprive you of your property, it can deprive you of your liberty by imprisoning you, and ultimately can deprive you of your life by killing you. And so people begin to look for ways to limit the state itself. So first we separate the state out, distinguish the state from other sorts of authorities, and then we start to ask, how do we limit the state? And this gives rise to a number of things that will be familiar to people in the room. The kinds of checks on power that are certainly part of the American tradition, but also other liberal traditions, separations of powers, checks and balances, independent judiciaries, written constitutions, bills of rights, all these sorts of things, federalism, right, come along as ways of limiting power. And so these two things come together, right? Liberalism, as I understand it, is a way of organizing properly political authority by distinguishing the sphere of political life from other realms of human life, and then within that sphere by limiting its exercise of power in various ways to prevent abuse and preserve peace. And so if we wanted to sum that up very briefly, we might say that liberalism is the practice of limited government. That's how I fundamentally think about it. It takes many forms, has somewhat different theoretical justifications given to it by different liberal theorists. It doesn't look exactly the same in the United States as it does in Canada or in England or in Germany or in France, whatever the case may be. But there's a sort of recognizable commitment to limiting power and, separating out political power from other kinds of authorities. That's what this thing is, as I understand it. So let me just make 3 observations about the thing before handing it on. First, as I've described it at least, liberalism is not committed to any objectionable views of the human person. It's not committed to an atomistic view of human life, It's not committed to an individualistic view of human life, not committed to a materialistic view of human life, to a bad anthropology or a deformed view of community. Some liberals might have objectionable views of the human person, right, or of human community, but there's nothing intrinsic to liberalism as such that requires us to hold such views. So Christians, for example, can in good conscience be liberals, right, without thinking that they are thereby committed to views that would be in conflict with the faith. So that's the first point. A second observation, well, maybe I'll just add on that first, and this is, I think, relevant to the topic of the panel. In my view, most of the critiques of liberalism that would fall under the broadly post-liberal label rest upon assuming that liberalism is committed to views it doesn't have to hold, right? That it is committed to certain ideas that I don't think it has to be committed to. So, second observation. Some of you might be thinking that in describing liberalism, I haven't said anything particularly inspiring or ambitious. Right? In large part, it's about stopping people from killing each other and fighting with each other. Now, I actually happen to think there is something inspiring about stopping people from killing each other, right? But it doesn't give us any warm vision of community, right? Any sense of what the highest form of human life would look like. I haven't said a word about that. To those of you who might be inclined to feel a little disappointed that my description doesn't sound more inspiring than it does, I would just suggest you think about the many places in the world, both today and throughout human history, in which those basic tasks of demarcating political authority, separating it from other kinds of authority, and limiting power have not or do not get done effectively. This is not uncommon, even today, and those are by and large not pleasant places to live. And so I think there are some real goods achieved here, in spite of the fact that we may not have given the kind of inspiring, heartwarming vision of community that some of the other talks might have helped us think about in other kinds of contexts. And so a last observation also building on that. Because liberalism in this sense, you might say, aims low, sets its sights sort of low, it periodically sparks revolts from those who want more from politics, who would like to think that political power can achieve some more inspiring, ambitious view of human community. I think the template for those kind of revolts is usually Rousseau. So if you're drawn to Rousseau, you might ask yourself whether you should be an integralist. But more recently, in the last century, the best examples of these revolts would be National Socialism and Communism, both of which sought far more from the state than liberalism seeks to offer. The revolts against liberalism can take milder forms than that. They don't have to be Nazis and commies, right? But nevertheless, I think we should not forget the kinds of pathologies that have arisen when people begin to ask more of the state than it is really intended to deliver or capable of delivering. And sort of a takeaway from this for me, and the way I sometimes like to describe this in teaching, is to say that although it might seem paradoxical, we actually end up with a better politics when we ask less of it. By demarcating the proper sphere of political authority, by seeking to limit abuse, we may not feel as though we're trying to accomplish the noblest, highest, grandest ideals, but we actually end up with better results. And that is not an outcome to be taken lightly. That's just a little bit of an intro to how I think of liberalism, what I think it is, and some of the features of it that might be worth thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah. Maybe, am I on? Can you hear me? Maybe one of the topics that we can take up in discussion as a result of this is this very important notion of civil society, and the whole realm that is, and that's one of the realms in which much of this fuller vision can be obtained. But I forget if it was you, maybe you even made the observation of von Hildebrand, that von Hildebrand does not have a political philosophy, he has a social philosophy. And that's also another very interesting way of thinking about these different realms. I think, maybe in the American context especially, we tend to politicize everything. And so we either crush or diminish or lose the range of these different realms, spheres that we live in. So, but I would love to pick up the civil society theme. So I'm just going to make a few remarks, maybe in the spirit of how I've come to thinking about this whole phenomenon of post-liberalism, and I want to do it maybe in you didn't do it in a particularly technical way, but I want to do it in an even less technical way than you did, so that I can make some observations about what struck me, and I guess ultimately I come to these issues being deeply steeped and informed by the personalist tradition and some of its central values. So I remember at the beginning of maybe this goes back earlier, but at the beginning of the first Trump administration, I started to hear friends of mine who were fellow conservatives speak in ways about politics and political goals in ways that I'd never heard before, certainly from a conservative. And so a very common trope even was this idea that, well, we have to use the same tactics as the left. So for one, they just assumed that the left was always going to cheat, but that if we had to use authority and force certain ends, including really fairly deep encroachments into people's moral convictions, that's okay. That's what these times call for. And I found that alarming, perhaps in part because of my personalist orientation. I think in part because of probably my liberal roots in the sense that you've given it, and fundamentally, I think even with respect to sort of core, sort of where we are today in Christian life and certainly within the Catholic post-Vatican II context. And this is when I started to, some of these same friends started to they began to invoke integralism or post-liberalism as ways of thinking about their hopes, and it tended to manifest itself mostly with the idea that, well, let's seize the city council, let's at least realize the kind of community we want here. Though, of course, often the ambitions were grander, and so the idea was if we can get and this is why the Trump presidency was so tantalizing to many of my friends. I even had one of our Chilean friends, whose name is now escaping me, told me that, why don't you just put the Hildebrand project aside and use this as an opportunity to go join this administration? You have a chance to shape a whole new national vision. And so I said, no thanks.
We missed the chance.
Yeah, well, I should have offered it to you. Christopher would have loved it.
Did you know about it?
Yeah. Christopher has more... well, no, I'll stop there. Christopher would never force anybody to do anything. No, but what I began to be struck by was the respect in which the idea of using various forms of force, legislative, perhaps and judicial in a particular kind of way, were sort of creeping even into the realm of sort of more ordinary things, even at the local level. In the back of my mind a particularly seminal book for me has always been Joseph Ratzinger's Truth and Tolerance. And in this book, he has this wonderful line where he says that in a free society, truth should only be promoted through persuasion. Now, does that mean that we can't ultimately pass laws? Of course. I mean, there's a moment in which a decision is made. But this idea that the basic mode of dealing with deep and fundamental political differences, and then perhaps ultimately differences of vision of worldview, philosophical differences, need to be sorted out in this way. But again, there was this kind of growing impatience. There was the sense that, this is not the culture we want to live in, and if we want it, we have to get it by any means necessary. Now, I don't mean to particularly demonize any of these friends and acquaintances of mine. Sometimes they weren't, I would describe them as conservative Christians. They weren't theorists. They weren't. But as a kind of mood, and then as a kind of phenomenon, and as a way of speaking and thinking, it became more and more pronounced. Another thing that I would run into, and maybe as a personalist, people felt the need to say this to me, but I remember on at least one occasion being told by someone, and I forget who it was now, but it was a more prominent conservative, that the project of John Paul II has failed. The political project, the project of cultural engagement, this wasn't even about the new evangelization. This idea of bearing witness in the world And particularly this phrase that is very dear to me and to many of us here, in which he speaks of the way in which the church proposes, she does not impose. And so that particular spirit of personal engagement, personal proposition, the idea of appealing to the conscience of the other, all these different ways in which John Paul addressed political conflict and public life, were somehow being thrown out in the name of not having the culture we want and the society that we want, and the fact that if we want it, we're now going to have to use radical and often compelling means. So I will say that this has been sort of alarming to me as a personalist. But at the same time, and Christopher and I have had these discussions. I have come more and more to the view that I understand what motivates so many of these people, because when I think of myself as a husband and a father, and I think of the world in which my children are growing up, and particularly when I look at all the sort of toxic and corrosive aspects of our society, I think to myself, well, goodness, this is not the world that I want them to live in. And in some ways, it's a less good world, in some ways perhaps, than I even grew up in. I mean, it's funny how we look back on our previous eras in our own time, and we look more favorably on them than we did at the time. But as a philosopher and as a Christian, I find that the commitment to proposition of truth, persuasion, and so on are simply they are simply without question essential and necessary, and to give them up seems to come at an enormously high price. And it seems to me, and this may be my concluding comment, that many of those for whom the JP2 project seems too toothless and not forceful enough, that they perhaps lack a sense of the achievements that go with religious liberty and freedom of conscience, and underestimate the damage that we will do to our own moral being and the moral being of our fellow citizens if we use political force in ways that simply steamrolls that. So it's this idea that even sometimes I even think that personalism is a kind of delicate flower that's risen up, and it's always at risk. And that, but as we have younger and younger generations, for example, for those who didn't, it's always a remarkable thing to me that the average college student today wasn't even alive. Well, you can be a college freshman today and not have been alive when Pope John Paul was elected. You could be a college student alive today and have no memory of the Benedict pontificate. So our memories are very short, so there's no sense really of what happened. But any of us who lived through the fall of the wall, I was just a child, but we talked about this last week, it made an enormous impression on me at the time. So there's this problem of the brevity of our memories. And so people, I think, often lack a sufficiently robust sense of what it is that we're going to part with in the name of establishing a more fundamentally Christian society. But I'll stop there and turn over to you.
Well, thank you. Peter, I was very sympathetic when you were talking about how your vision of politics is not inspiring. My sister and I, for the last 8 years or so, have talked about how we should run for president together as co-presidents, and our slogan would be, make politics boring again. But what I want to do today is, I guess I do want to talk with a little bit more technical precision, and I want to lay out sort of more precisely what I take to be the core claims of at least Catholic post-liberalism, and the vision of the human person that animates those. And then I want to contrast that to a personalist vision of the human person in relationship to the state. And here I'm going to be drawing on this text that we keep coming back to, Hildebrand's Metaphysics of Community. Hildebrand does not use the word integralism in there, but he spends about, 3 or 4 chapters critiquing integralism there, and I think his critique is quite powerful and points to a powerful vision of the human person that I think we'd do well to take seriously. So I take integralism, or Catholic post-liberalism more broadly, to be based on a view of the human person that has roots in Aristotle. And I'm not directly critiquing Aristotle or the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition here, but I think it has tendencies in problematic directions, which I'm going to outline. The view of the human person here is one on which persons are the sorts of beings who strive to achieve goods. Right? There are various goods that we need in order to flourish. And above all, we strive for common goods. These are the ends, the goals of the human person. Common goods here are goods that are essentially shareable among many people. Right? Things like knowledge, political security, political peace, union with God. Right? These are goods where just because I achieve them, that doesn't preclude you in any way from achieving them. Unlike, say, a material good where if I have it, you can't have the exact same good. Right? So human beings are striving for these common goods. They are the ends or goals of the human person. And because these goods are common, we don't strive for them as individuals, we strive for them as communities. So communities are organized around the pursuit of common goods. And on this understanding, as I understand it, persons then are subordinated to common goods. We are, in a sense, at the service of these common goods, and therefore under the power of the communities that have been organized to pursue these common goods. This is the reason why on most sort of integralist models, Aristotelian Thomistic models, the state has the authority to execute you. Right? Because the state is organized for the pursuit of certain common goods, political peace, political security, and the state authority has the right to decide when a particular member of the community, subordinated to this common good, is no longer serving that end and therefore needs to be removed. So this model invests a great deal of power in the authority in a community. The last thing that to sort of finally get to the integralism, the integral part of it, on this vision of the human person in relation to community, we find communities forming a sort of ladder, or to use Hildebrand's metaphor, a staircase, as he puts it. Right? So I'm a member, I'm part of a marriage. My marriage strives for certain common goods, but those common goods are less common, less shared, than the goods for which my family strives. So my marriage is subordinated to the family. The family strives for common goods, but they are less common, less shared, than the goods for which my city strives. So my family is subordinated to the city. It's under the authority of the city, and it needs to serve the ends of the city. The city's ends are less common than the state, and so we get this sort of hierarchy, right? And above the state is the church, right? So we have an authority of the church over the state because the church is striving for the most common, the most shareable of all goods, right? Ultimate union with God of the whole human race. And so we have this sort of subordination of communities. And this also means then that the lower communities on this staircase need to serve, coercively when necessary, the ends of the higher communities. And so the state is going to need to, in some circumstances at least, coercively impose aspects of the church. Okay, that's a very sort of broad outline, and I know there are lots of different brands and versions of post-liberalism and integralism, and feel free to quibble with any aspect of that picture that I just painted during the Q&A. That's the model there. I want to contrast that now briefly to a personalist model. And I'm going to follow the exact same line of reasoning that I used in my talk on Monday. There I critiqued individualism, and I said the fundamental problem, I think, with individualism is that it has too restrictive a view of what the human person can do. Right? Individualism says, how do we fundamentally act? We act in a way motivated, always in a means-end fashion. Right? So I'm always pursuing some end, pursuing some goal, and employing various means to get there. And personalism critiques this by saying, no, we don't always act in a means-end fashion. We also act under the motivation of value. Right? I can act in such a way that I'm responding to the importance of something for its own sake. Right? I'm admiring a person's beauty. Right? I am holding up an example of justice. I am adoring God. Right? So I'm responding to value, not in order to achieve some further end, but purely for its own sake. so not in a means-end fashion. And I think the various post-liberalisms, integralisms fall into the exact same error. That is, they think that we only act in such a way that we are striving to achieve various goods, to bring about various goods, achieve knowledge, achieve political peace, achieve salvation, always understood as ends. And they fail to take into account the ways in which human beings respond to things for their own sake, for their value. And so they leave out, by and large, the whole account of the unitive power of value that Dr. Federica so beautifully told us about this morning. As a result, they give an inadequate account of the foundations of community. Now, Hildebrand's further critique of the integralist model is that communities are interrelated in much, much more complex ways than this simple staircase, this simple ladder. There are ways in which marriage is the paradigmatic community, right? It is the sort of community of human love par excellence. And all other communities are lower than it in terms of the pursuit and expression of love. But there's a way in which the church is the highest community in other respects. There's a way in which humanity as a whole is the highest community in yet other respects. So there are sort of mutual subordinations that we find among various communities in different respects. And all of those sort of interlocking networks of authority and power need to be understood, and we need to live out of that network of different sorts of authority if we're going to live an adequate and fully fulfilling life as a human being. And I think for this reason, some of the things that Hildebrand says about the state, and I think more than what he says explicitly, the way we can sort of develop his thought, would point us towards a sort of liberal conception of the state. It has a limited sphere. It's important in terms of the enforcement of temporal law, but it's a very limited sphere, and it itself is subordinate to and higher than other communities in different respects. But it needs to be treated as the precise sort of community that it is. Much like Dr. Jeffries has been saying, we need to understand each community in terms of its own structure and live in accord with that. So it's in terms, I think, of that sort of fundamentally contrasting vision of the human person that I would want to resist the various post-liberal proposals that have been put before us. And with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Okay.
I'm going to, we can turn all the mics on. I'm going to start with a question for you, Peter. I'm curious your thoughts as well. And we're going to, of course, take the audience questions as well. One of the things, I'll play a little bit devil's advocate here. One of the things that a lot of critics of liberalism would say is that it really is not like a neutral space that just deals with problems and you can have whatever kind of values that you want to have, right? They would say that either it requires certain values, or you said that it doesn't, but they would also perhaps say it excludes certain types of values. There are certain sorts of values that you can't have in a liberal space. You have to have a certain sort of denuded public square and things like this. You can't have, an particularly important role for the church. You can't recognize the church as an authority over the state because the state has to be the ultimate authority. So are there values that liberalism excludes or makes particularly difficult, not even just to hold, but perhaps to practice, right? You see these kind of cases all the time. Like an example, and kind of near to us in Oklahoma, this went all the way to the Supreme Court, I believe. Like there was advertisements for an adult video store in this like small town, but truckers drove through that town, so it got a fair amount of traffic, and no one wanted this, right? No one wanted this, and so they tried to take it down, and of course, First Amendment, it wins out, and we would probably all say yay First Amendment, but we would also say boo, like adult video store in this community town, right? And these people, this was a failure of them to be able to live out their values in a liberal state, right? Like they had these values, but they couldn't do it because the state ultimately was the value. So is there a sense in which a liberal society, either particularly conceived or in general, excludes or trumps certain sorts of values? And is that if so, is that a thing we just accept?
There's at least one basic way in which I think it does. So I've described liberalism as committed to achieving peace among human beings. So if you don't accept that value, you're going to be excluded. And so if you're a Nietzschean who wants to enforce your will to power on everybody else, liberalism has a beef with you, I think. So not purely neutral, and that's not the most important case you have in mind, of course, the rampant Nietzschean out there. So I wouldn't, it's probably the case, right, that under contemporary circumstances, liberalism makes it hard to live out in the public square certain very thick visions of communal life. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's because of liberalism. I think that's because of pluralism and diversity. Right? And so maybe I could add something to what I said before. So I focused in on this idea of liberalism, right? But because it's usually liberalism that is the target of the post-liberal critiques. We don't actually usually call our system liberalism simply. We almost always call it something like liberal democracy or constitutional democracy or democratic republicanism or something like that. They always have two words that are actually in the labels we use, one of which gets at the liberal half of things, the limits on power, and another of which gets at what you might call the representative function of the state. And so I don't think liberal democracy in and of itself is an obstacle toward the culture in various ways, seeping over into the public square insofar as our laws and policies always represent the culture. But when the culture is itself extremely diverse, as I think is almost always the case under modern conditions of economic development and liberty, what comes out of that representative process is also going to be less thick than some people might like. We have additional ways of trying to deal with that, though. So, for example, in the American system, federalism is a really important component that allows different communities with different cultures to lead somewhat different kinds of public life together. The schools don't have to be the same everywhere. Zoning laws don't have to be the same everywhere. I think there is some room for debate about what exactly the First Amendment does or doesn't permit. And that might vary from place to place. Public nudity and things like this. Okay, so there are ways, I think, that federalism lets us do that. And then just to give a nod to John Henry and bring civil society in, civil society is a label that's usually used to describe the whole realm of social life between the state and the individual. And there's all kinds of activities that go on in that middle space, again, which liberalism doesn't necessarily have a beef with. And in American history, this has been a very vibrant space. I mean, the classic description of American democracy, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, has this sort of, he is astounded by what he sees in civil society, all the associations that form up in American public life. He says at one point, kind of a famous line, that when there's some need to be served publicly, in France, he's a Frenchman writing to the in France, you would see the state at the head of an effort to attend to that need. In England, you would see some noble lord at the head of that effort. In America, a bunch of citizens form an association to try to do it. And they do it for all kinds of things. He sort of, you can see in the text him imagining his French reader back home kind of scratching his head and thinking, it's really like that, I don't get that, I can't imagine it being like that over there. So, but if you want to think what this is, the example I like to use is you imagine yourself driving down the highway, right? And every 2 miles there's a little sign. These 2 miles of the highway are being cleaned up, the litter's cleaned up by the Kiwanis, right? Or some church, or the Little League, or like that list of us. So there's all these ways that within liberal democracy, I think we have opportunities to live out versions of a communal life. And of course, the other, I'll stop then, but the other question to be asked is always what the alternatives are and what costs come with them. So
that may be a more compelling answer for me, but Mark, you had something.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful. I mean, you've mentioned sort of different liberalisms. Would it be helpful to sort of acknowledge that American liberalism is perhaps a bit more separated from religious concerns than other sorts of liberalism? So many European liberal democracies have been able to recognize a church or form concordats with the Catholic Church, even if they're not officially Catholic, and so have a kind of recognition of Christian or other religious values in their law without encroaching upon the sphere of the church. And so, there's an established church in England,
right?
So sort of official recognition without that overcoming a lot of diversity and so forth.
And there is an important question there, which is largely an empirical question, whether that's good for the church.
Sure, yeah, but I'm just saying
Right.
Liberalism is broad enough that it can include these kinds of arrangements.
Absolutely.
Peter, do you think that, to this point, and to follow up on Christopher's question about the supposedly sort of neutral space that liberalism creates, you said before, many people have a beef with liberalism, but what they're doing is they're importing some anthropological vision and attributing that to the liberalism. But like the Schindlerian, the critique of David Schindler Sr., the father of D.C. Schindler, who's prominent spokesman in this post-liberal debate, he was quite famous for his debates with Michael Novak over the degree to which American-style liberalism, at least, was somehow sort of deeply informed by a certain conception of the human person. And he expressed that in different ways. Sometimes it was sort of the idea that it was just in the DNA, it was just irremovably part of it. And other times it was this idea that it was it was fully developed, and of course he laid it at the feet of Protestants, right? It was the implicit Protestant commitments of the founders, and how this crept into the. So the question is just: is there really such a thing? On the one hand, maybe we want to say liberalism as a theory, perhaps as a political theory, aspires to be neutral, but is it ever really neutral?
Well, no, and I say I already insisted, even not just conceded. It's not neutral in every respect. It values peace, right? Peace is a good to be shared, a very important good that politics serves. But it's not entirely neutral. In terms of this vision, I take it that the vision, you didn't say what the vision of the human person was, but the kind of an individualistic.
Yeah, exactly. The idea that the Schindler view is sort of the view of Ratzinger and others, which is that relationality is equally fundamental to individuality. And so this produced this whole.
What I would say about that, I think, is there's no doubt that various people from America and from elsewhere have seen a kind of individualism in American culture. Right? But I think it's that's just a far too oversimplified depiction of what American life is like. So I'd go back to the Tocqueville's image, for example, where he sees all of this associational life. Right? I don't actually think it's correct, sort of empirically correct, that Americans lead somehow more individualistic lives than people elsewhere in other parts of the world. Robert Putnam's famous study about bowling alone, he was worried someone was dying down, but it wasn't because of liberalism, it was because of other things. Again, he investigates this rich associational life in American life. Americans are always described as joiners, right? The church, so when I say the church, I don't mean just the Catholic Church, right? I mean the Christian church, broadly speaking. Like, the church has flourished in America, more so than just about any other developed country you're going to think of. I probably won't just make it developed. I mean, I don't know that the church has always been so healthy in developing countries either. The church has done well in the United States. So I think if you said to me, really there are no individual strands in American life? Of course there are individual strands in American culture, whether that's due to the founding or whether that's due to Protestantism or whether that's due to the frontier, the famous Jameson thesis. It could be all sorts of things. But I think that to sort of pick out that strand and say, here's a description of American culture is just a vast oversimplification.
I think people, again, I'm kind of speaking on behalf of people and maybe playing a bit devil's advocate. I think a lot of people might concede what you're saying and go, okay, liberalism is about peace, fine. But that's not enough. That isn't working, right? Peace has, if it hasn't made these various problems worse, it's sort of allowed institutions to corrode and civil society to become bankrupt. And so maybe peace ought not be the highest value, right? Maybe holiness, maybe virtue, right? And then these other alternatives, these post-liberal visions become attractive in just that capacity. They say, like, we think something higher than peace ought to be the goal of organizing our society. I don't think that's exactly the way I often see it phrased, but I think that would be a compelling, I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's just fine. I'm totally on board with that. And that might be the more pointed kind of critique. Thoughts on?
Perhaps the problem here is that we have come, you mentioned the sort of over-politicization of modern culture. we have come to think of the state as the organizing principle of our society. Whereas the state is a very important community, but not the only community, and not the overall organizing community. And it seems like a liberal can perfectly well and should perfectly well acknowledge that peace is not the highest good,
Right.
but it's a necessary good. And there
It's
are
a
other
good that politics pursues.
And that's
Yeah,
the good that the
yeah.
state pursues,
Right,
but
yeah.
that not
and there are other communities
Yeah.
that pursue those help us pursue those higher goods, and in which we pursue those highest goods. But if you don't have peace, it's hard to pursue those.
Yeah, and liberalism would allow for exactly that kind of hierarchy and different understanding of these different roles. That kind of is its proper place.
Yeah.
And just to pick up on a couple things there also. So we have actually, in the course of the last couple of days, described the state, that word, as a community. Or I shouldn't say described it, named it in lists of communities. It's not clear to me that we should actually call the state as such a community. The people is a community, and the state is a set of institutions for serving certain needs of the people. Whether it's community, I'm not sure. But the other thing I wanted to say is, so you said, like, okay, maybe liberalism is a piece of it, but it's not working. And I think lots of what you commented, what as a father, as a husband, what do I want? I think lots of the motive behind the various post-liberal critiques is this fear that it's not working. But I think what I would want to say about that is, when we say it's not working, we're always making an implicit comparison. Right? We have something else in mind that we think works better. So we have to ask, well, what is that something else you have in mind that you think worked better that we could have? And I want to know, sort of, well, what is it? Is it someplace else in the world? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it Iran? Is it Germany or France? I like Europe. My wife's German. But okay, so where is it exactly that's so much better? Maybe it's the Middle Ages.
It's this imaginary time in the 1950s that never existed.
Well, that's my last one. But so,
1250.
Medieval world. Most of you, maybe one of you is not. Everybody else in the room is a peasant engaged in back-breaking subsistence labor, right? And you're probably deeply superstitious. I mean, you may have some sense that the church was flourishing, but you're probably some weird mix of pagan superstition and some kind of Christianity, and maybe you get a mass once every few months or something like that, right? So I don't think it's the Middle Ages. Is it this imaginary period in the 1950s? Yeah. Not if you're black, right? Maybe not if you're a woman. Right? And so when we say it's not working, I have deep sympathy with all of the things people are thinking about when they say it's not working. I worry about all those things a lot. There are all kinds of problems. But
do you we lay this at the feet of the state, whether the government in Washington or in our states, or do we lay it at the feet of the state because for many Christians, many of the particular encroachments have come to us through Supreme Court rulings, for example, on marriage, or the life issue has so large. I mean, so much of the pro-life movement's energy has played out at the level of legislation and court cases, and when we try to protect ourselves, so to speak, when there are encroachments into the local community like this sign, we go looking to the levers of power, and we often end up feeling, I think, the victim, exposed, etc. So just to try to flesh out why people go looking. So on the one hand, as you say, there might be a comparison to an unreal past. But I also wonder whether it's also, and that's why, as I said at the beginning, there was such enthusiasm among many of my, maybe your conservative friends. They weren't even necessarily enthusiastic for Trump. There was this idea that we can help stand up a new conservative government. Mm-hmm. So what do you think about the fact that many of our losses have been at the hands of, or we perceive as being at the hands of government and its different powers and arms?
So there's government broadly, and then there's the court specifically. I think the court is also a mixed bag, right? There's the marriage decision, but there's Dobbs, right? Overturning Roe v. Wade, like what Christian conservatives have longed for my entire lifetime, happened. So,
But what have you done for me lately?
yeah, right. And on religious liberty, the court has been pretty good.
Yeah, that's
the court has actually had unanimous or near unanimous rulings over the last 10 to 15 years on a number of religious liberty cases, upholding religious liberties in the court. More broadly speaking, why do we turn to the courts? Well, because the deliberative institutions don't seem to function well. Why they don't is a very complicated question and really above my pay grade. I need an institutionalist who does Congress and things like that to give you a better answer than I could as a political theorist. But part of the problem, I think, goes back to something that we are a very pluralistic people. And at some level, you have to decide whether you're willing to live with the hard work of trying to persuade people to do things your way, even though a lot of the time it's not going to seem to work, or whether you're going to grasp the levers of power.
Yeah, let's turn it over to the audience. I'm sure you all have some thoughts and questions as well.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Meilaender. There are really many questions I want to ask, and many things I want to disagree with. But I guess the most foundational question I could ask is about one of the American founders, James Madison, and his Federalist paper 51, and where he tells us that the Constitution is built to use ambition to counteract ambition. You said a Christian could live quite compatibly in a liberal system, or at least in some sort of liberal system. Is using sin to counteract sin, is that a Christian principle?
A Christian need have no objection to Federalist 51, right? Federalist 51, which is probably, so America's been really good at political practice and bad at political philosophy. It's the one really original, I think, philosophical contribution to the theory of democratic government that the founders made. Look, all he's saying in Federalist 51 is that you need to create institutions that will check and limit power, given the realities of the world we live in, which includes the fact that we are fallen. And so I would say that Christians, of all people, who have a deep conviction of human sinfulness and of the persistence of human sinfulness, should be very prepared to ask, well, how can we design institutions in such a way that that sinfulness will do as little harm as possible? And that's all that Madison is doing there. He's not encouraging anybody to sin. He's not saying it's a good thing if you're a sinner, but he does say you should probably expect your political leaders to be ambitious people. And if you think he's right about that, then it's probably not a bad idea to have them butting heads with each other rather than in cahoots against us.
I mean, another way to you reframe your same question, is it okay to have sin check sin? Well, is it okay to have sinful people check sinful people? I hope so, because that's your only option, right? I mean, if your strategy is like, let's have a government of saints, there's a great book by Dante you can read about that, but like, it's just, that's not going to work, right? So, I mean, what is this sin without a sinner, right? And so that's just the real world, right? I think it's probably an uncharitable reading to just cast it in that way, right? But I know you have another.
Well, what if there's a chance to be led by a virtuous leader? Say Blessed Charles, for example.
That's great, but you can't require to start with virtuous leaders. Like, that can't be your starting point. Like, okay, virtuous people, then government, right? Like,
there's a better example than Blessed Charles, actually, whom most historians regard as relatively ineffective. George Washington. Let's keep it with Madison in the American context, right? The Americans had a leader who was looked on widely as the embodiment of Republican virtue, who probably could have been a king had he wanted to. Fortunately did not. So all Madison is saying there, I think, is maybe you'll get lucky and you'll have a Washington come by at a key moment, but don't count on it. That's not the norm.
But I think we can do better than that too, right? Even as in a liberal government, that is, we can recognize that and I think many of the founders did, and they talk about this idea of an aristocracy of virtue, we can set up other institutions, educational institutions. We can encourage the well-being of the churches and of other associations, which will encourage virtue, which will sort of raise the likelihood of having a virtuous, saintly leader. And that seems to be a crucial part of a flourishing liberal democracy, and maybe part of our current problem is the breakdown of those institutions, not the liberal state.
Yes, so get these things on. So I'm just wondering if there's ways in a personalist view the state could go about promoting goods, especially a moral goodness and virtue among its people. It seems that on my view the state arises from us being in it's a community we belong to, whether we like it or not, and so I see that in some of Leo XIII's social encyclicals. So I'm just wondering how, in virtue of us belonging to that community, what's the state's role in promoting natural goodness amongst us as people?
You're all looking at me.
Can I summarize your answer? I mean,
I don't know.
You can tell me that. Yeah, you can tell me if I'm right. I mean, I think we would say that the role of the state is to promote peace, such that the institutions that are properly ordered to those very things you're asking can do that well, right? That the church, that the school, that the home, like the other communities, for which their ends are virtues and or maybe their unifying values are more like the things you're pursuing, can do it. But that isn't really the role, or at least certainly need not be the role of the state. And so to ask the question is already to kind of to give the state that role. And I think that a liberal view, at least the way that we're discussing it here, would say, look, that isn't what the state is necessarily supposed to do. Right?
Though also, I mean, the state is, consists of various bodies, right, deliberative bodies among them, in which we not only pursue peace, but we deliberate and discuss the best way to pursue peace. And in doing so, we will talk about the various kinds of policies that we will have towards society, including, we can talk about the pedagogical role of law in inculcating those virtues which are conducive to peace, which will not be all the virtues, right? The state is not going to talk about the virtues as such necessary for pursuing union with God, but they will talk about the virtues necessary for pursuing peace in all of its forms.
Well, and the state, you talk about the pedagogical role of law, right?
Yeah.
So law does teach in all kinds of ways. And we do that even in a liberal state. You can't not do that because law just does it, right? So even in a liberal state, we do that. And it's often very subtle, right? So, you get you can argue about whether this is a good thing. You get a tax deduction for the mortgage interest on your home payment. And that's because Americans, most of them, by and large, think that owning a home is actually a good thing and develops certain virtues and contributes to the public good. When cities build sports stadia, they pass often to fund them sin taxes. We call them sin taxes, right, on alcohol and tobacco. Is that the best way? I don't know, but so that suggests this is not. These are activities we somewhat discourage, right? And some of the tough cases about free speech or even freedom of religion, right? The American Supreme Court has a particularly, compared to most countries, particularly robust free speech regime. But there's nothing in the Constitution, and I actually think there's some fairly good reasons for that. I'm fairly supportive of that, but there's nothing in the Constitution that forecloses all of those cases, right? So that if you just want to open a topless dancing bar right outside campus, the Constitution does not, I think, preclude the local community from saying, no, you can't do that here. Or something like school vouchers, I think of freedom of religion. Monies get channeled to Christian-sponsored religious institutions, and the court has held that that is consistent with the First Amendment, the religion clauses. So there are lots of ways that you can sort of do this in more subtle fashions that represent the community.
Thank you, all four of you. I have a question kind of following up on that. the idea that I think Newhouse criticized the naked public square, and that we've kind of talked about these things. I think one of the post-liberal critiques is that liberalism is living on borrowed time. That borrowed time was, broadly speaking, a Judeo-Christian, whether Protestant, Catholic, mostly Protestant, ethic, with its flaws and blind spots, certainly. But that is sort of running its course, and as well as some churches are doing, by every measure, church attendance is declining, marriage is declining, childbearing is declining. So all of these things that were assumed are no longer the case. And so what would you make of that critique in particular, that the state is actually it is advocating for a particular ethical view that is not conducive to the flourishing of human life? And it also, just a comment, it seems like Christians should want in the public sphere to advocate for those public goods, such as, I don't know, no-fault divorce seems to make it very, very easy to divorce, and people are doing it, and it's bad for kids. So those kinds of things seem to be Christian convictions that are also very good for the flourishing of human life. And I think, what do you make of that critique, and is there room for that in those who would advocate for a different perspective than just liberalism? What would you say to that, Peter?
I have a very similar question. Can I add? Sure. My question would be hypothetical, but it's completely in line with David. The question would be, for a Hindu, or for a conservative person, or for a Muslim, why would the liberal state be better than a Catholic state? And with Catholic state, I mean now where the main proposal issues from Christ and his claim, which is the truth. So not from an all-seeing eye, from Christ and his claim, acknowledging the freedom of members of religions to found their own schools. That's not excluded in a Catholic state. Yeah? Now, it seems to be strange to say such a thing, a Catholic state, we cannot go back anymore to the Middle Ages or whatever. Still, to think about it, I think it's still to think through this. So what David also said, Cardinal Biot, I think in the 20s, said, ultimately, we have to be careful. So back then, the church said liberalism is a sin. It changed in the late 50s, 60s, Courtney Murray, etc. So Biot said, watch out, a liberal state, when push comes to shove, it is not that liberal at all. Yeah, it rules and it imposes. Yeah, and then how does it do that? Through propaganda tools, media, and the money power. Yeah, so that's the same question, I think, as David. So the liberal state is not that neutral. So what would you say about it? Thank you.
I actually think that the questions are reversed in some ways. I don't think it's the same question, because the first question is about, can we within the liberal state sort of bring some Christian values to bear? And the second presumes, well, let's have a specifically Christian state, and does that have room then for non-Christians in it? So it's actually almost kind of a reverse situation. On the first, I've no beef with any of the things you're describing. I think all of you should go out in the public square and argue for the things you believe in. Right? There are versions of liberalism that would hold you shouldn't do that you're not allowed to make arguments that rest on religious premises, for example. I think those are mistaken versions of liberalism. They're bad. Go out and argue for whatever you believe in. Try to persuade people. Right? If there's too much divorce, well, that's on us. It's not the state that makes, the liberal state is not making people get divorced. And so, go out and do the hard work of persuading people. As for whether Hindus would be better off in a Catholic state, probably worth asking the Hindus what they thought about that. I mean, my own answer is actually more. I think that, as I understand the state, the Catholic state, as would be the case of a Lutheran state or a Hindu state, is actually a contradiction in terms that the state is a temporal institution for temporal purposes, and so it doesn't have an ecclesial character to it. The church is a different kind of institution. But.
Can I add one thing? It seems to me that another concept that is missing but is implied, for example, in David's comment, is this idea of culture. So not just civil society, but culture. So we say that the liberal state doesn't encourage no-fault divorce. Well, maybe it encourages it to the extent that it's very easy. But putting that aside, what is it about our culture that makes people so quickly run to no-fault divorce? And this comes up often when why is the marriage rate declining? And there are, I think, very intelligent commentaries about, for example, how marriage assumes a kind of basic hope, for the future, and that it's worth having children. There are many people who think for whom there's a sort of basic hopelessness in the idea of bringing children into the world. And of course, they rationalize it in different ways. But this gets into the realm, I think, of culture in a pre-political sense. And a lot of the work I think that we have to do as Christians, I think, is in the realm of culture, not necessarily politics. So we've identified civil society, but culture is a different dimension.
I'd also want to sort of maybe expand, acknowledging that there's something sort of maybe potentially contradictory in the idea of a Catholic state, sort of expand the way in which we understand that notion. So one way in which that's often understood, the way in which I think maybe Cardinal Biot and people like this are understanding it, is that the state is going to be explicitly, in the content of positive law, Catholic, right? Establish the church, have explicit laws promoting the church or defending her rights or things like this. And it seems to me that the vision proposed, for example, in Gaudium et Spes at the Second Vatican Council, allows for a sort of much more expansive notion of what a Catholic state would be, in which, although the state as such, in the content of its law, does not enshrine Catholic claims, Catholics enter into the state, right, as lay people, acting as politicians, as statesmen, and imbue the state through the power of persuasion with Catholic values and Catholic thoughts. And so there's sort of a broader way in which the state can be subordinated to Christ, other than an explicit subordination in the content of positive law. And I would see this as sort of yet again another case of the hyper-politicization of contemporary society, and not just the hyper-politicization, but we entirely think about politics in terms of positive law, right? In terms of propositional law, where it's explicitly stated. And yet again, the liberal tradition allows for a much more expansive conception of law, say with the idea of the English common law, and the sort of robust role for custom there. Right? Cardinal Biot is reacting to the Third Republic in France, which has a very positivistic conception of law, but liberalism is broader than that.
We have 5 more minutes, so we'll take 1, maybe 2 very short questions.
I'd like to get back to the earlier suggestion that perhaps the real issue here is not to be laid at the foot of the state, but at our other institutions. And that idea really made me think of Jefferson's composition of the Virginia Declaration of 1776. And at the end of that document, written about a month before the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson he ends the document reflecting on, you could say, the precariousness of a state in this new liberal tradition that they're trying to envision, because he says that the state does not have the power, or ought not to have the power, to establish religion, to mandate attendance at church, these sorts of things, and to compel belief. And he says, part of the reason for that is it's not good for belief. You don't get an authentic Christianity out of that, or an authentic religiosity. But on the other hand, he says that nonetheless, the state depends upon a practice of, and he explicitly puts it in these terms, Christian beneficence and the practice of all these sorts of virtues. And this is something that I think that the writers of the Federalist Papers really understand as well. And in fact, I think that what the whole purpose of some of these reflections is to try to lay out a constitutional morality, a sort of practice that Americans are being sort of encouraged to take up in order to maintain our politics, and particularly they're warning against the problem of factionalism and the problems that are imposed by the passions. And we have to be prepared as a nation, as a community, to wrestle internally and outside of the context of the state apparatus in order to keep the state. So we have this sort of the radical dependence of our political order upon a set of things that politics actually can't regulate. And that maybe that's actually where the failure that people see is occurring. And it's just a category error in thinking, well, what we really need is a post-liberal order in order to deal with this problem, when in fact we need to maybe look to ourselves and get our own house in order, so to speak, before we point to the political and say that's the problem.
I think we all agree. We can get one more question still, but that seems exactly right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. At our liberal arts-based institution, Ave Maria, we often talk about the fact that every discipline needs to do a minimum of philosophizing with respect to its own discipline in knowing the parameters of it by understanding its object and its method. So just very minimal. Every physicist, mathematician, and so forth should at least know that much philosophy to be able to do their discipline correctly. So analogous to that, Hildebrand says in the Metaphysics of Community that all authority, when he's speaking specifically about the state, that the authority of the state comes from God, and that the state has the obligation of recognizing that its authority comes from God. I'm just wondering how that would fit in with the liberal view. Would you say that there's some sense in which, even though the specific domain in which the state operates is the civil one, it's the public sphere and so forth, that nevertheless there's some sort of metaphysical presuppositions that are at work that it ought to be itself aware of in order for its authority and power to be exercised correctly, whether implicitly or explicitly? Do you think that there's some requirement for that? So just, I don't know if that's taking us too far afield, but it's...
No, actually, I think it's a good question. I might formulate aspects of it in slightly different ways, but so absolutely I agree. The state's authority comes from God, right? The powers are ordained by God. And so God has granted temporal authority to serve certain needs that human beings have. I think it's correct that the state will function poorly without at least an implicit acknowledgement of that fact, right? That it is not God, right? But that it gets its authority from God. I think what I would want to say is that it's actually liberalism as a system that has been the best at making that implicit acknowledgement, because it recognizes that its power is limited. That's what a liberal is committed to. So we don't stand in the place of God. We are established for certain limited purposes. I don't think most liberal states make that explicit, although they can. I don't know that I have a beef with that. There's debate about whether the European Union Constitution should have a reference to the Christian heritage of Europe, for example. If it's in there, fine. We have a reference to at least God and the Declaration of Independence. So sure, I think an explicit one is fine. I don't think it has to be explicit, but I actually think it is, in a sense, in the DNA of liberalism to recognize its own limits. And that's a way of saying we do not, we get our power from God for certain purposes, but not for all of them. So I actually think that your question points toward one of the virtues of liberalism.
I would also, if I could just add to that, it seems to me that one can acknowledge that one's authority comes from God in a range of ways, one of which is acknowledging that one's community is organized by the transcendent call of value. Right? So we may not explicitly use the word God, but sort of under these transcendent values, the community is organized together. And I'd want to contrast sort of two ways in which a state can be organized. One is where we recognize ourselves brought together under the value of law and the value of peace, and that organizes us sort of for this higher purpose. Right? We've sort of been called together to this higher purpose. It's a limited purpose. It's not the highest purpose, but it is a higher purpose. Contrast that to sort of a purely procedural, bureaucratic state, right, in which the state takes itself to be purely sort of providing services. There's the Bill Kavanaugh's paper, is it dying for the telephone company or killing for the telephone company, right? That like the modern state has become nothing more than sort of another version of the telephone company. It provides you with services. And I think that's not the vision that the classical liberal tradition is providing us with. It does provide a sort of inspiring sort of unity, right? And that is to implicitly acknowledge at least that one is not just engaged in providing purely worldly services, but one is called up to this higher purpose, right? And as a value, it is a divine purpose.
Mark, do you think, I'm just curious, you said acknowledging that you're drawn together under the call of values.
Yeah.
Do you think that something like the Declaration of Independence
Absolutely.
would be?
Yeah. I mean, the preamble to the Constitution and a lot of these documents you find throughout speeches and so forth have this awareness that right, there are these mystic cords that bind us together.
Okay.
And yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Now that we have solved all the questions to everyone's satisfaction, we'll draw this panel to a close.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.